Today's podcast is actually really kind of a privilege for me. Tommy Dog is somebody that I've seen on the internet for about as long as I've been on the internet. And so when I had an opportunity to talk to him about some other things, I raised the option of talking to us on the podcast as well. This is going to be interesting for me because while I've seemed to have been around Tommy a lot, I didn't know a lot about him or about his work. I've run into him at trade shows and stuff, but I really wanted to learn more. So luckily, Tommy was willing to give up an hour of his time to have a chat, and it was really quite fascinating. I hope you enjoy. All right, today we are going to meet someone that is sort of an internet legend to me. I first ran across him on the Max news list. He stood out because where everyone else would have things like, "Hi, I am Professor XYZ," here was Tommy Dog. So Tommy Dog was part of the Max list, like going back to the McGill days, I think. And and it was really fun to kind of follow him as he was like getting his arms around what was happening with Max. And then I ran into him at the AES show, and I got a great story about that. Basically, I was at the Focal Press booth. I was going through their books, and this arm reaches in front of me to get a book, and tattooed across the arm is the words Tommy Dog. And I was like, oh, I know who that is. It seems like we have occupied the same virtual space for as long as there's been an internet, because right now he's active on the Muff Wiggler site, which is where I hang out for the modular gear pile. We just kind of run in the same circles, but we are very different people. And so I really wanted to take the opportunity to talk to Tommy, have him talk a little bit about his work and also sort of his aesthetic and the way that he pulls together a diverse set of influences to do what he does. So, hi Tommy, how are you?
I'm all right. How are you doing today?
Had a long day. It was soccer day with the kid a little bit.
That's real life. That's where the art comes from.
I guess so. I hope. I hope it does, because otherwise I just shot a day. Right?
Well, I'd like to think at least during the drives, from hither to thither or what have you, you're at least doing some coding or something.
Right. Well, I definitely whenever I do like one of these day-long treks, it does seem like I come back with a head full of stuff. So that's actually a really good point. So let's kick this off by having you tell us a little bit about your artistic work, kind of the whole range of it, if you don't mind.
I'm a couple of things, and a lot of people are a little confused as to what I am and what I do. So I'm going to sort of break it down into the most simple way that I can. I am a fan collector, and I am a musician, and I'm a musician technician. So I do studio work, and I collect things like musical instruments and records. And like most musicians, I also do some art. And because of the various technologies that musicians come in contact with beyond their distortion pedal, I got into the recording studio, and the ideas that I had just kept mutating. My background is punk, so I always wanted to find new ways of doing things, which put me in this odd place of being a guy who likes 3-chord dummy rock, who wants to then do programming to make a machine do 3-chord dummy rock so I can learn how to play with that machine. And sort of out of that, I've grown into experimenting with building a robot who can't play drums very well. And I've gotten into projection devices, and sort of I've touched upon sort of all the things that a musician deals, most musicians don't deal with robots, but tomorrow is the future, and we will be dealing with robots. But everything else I deal with is the technology that is around any musician. It's just that I actually take the time to learn a little bit about the language so I can kind of get what I want from a lighting person or from the studio or whatever, and I just sort of take my being a dilettante a little bit too far, as I did with Max and everywhere else I go. Is that a...
I think that's a pretty good thing. What are some specific works that you've been involved in?
Specific works recently or over the years?
Oh, over the years. I mean, you talk about having a punk background.
Okay, well,
how did that express itself?
I got into punk in 1978, and I was 10 years old, and nobody wanted to be in a band with me. And because who the hell wants to be in a band with a 10-year-old, particularly one who is extremely opinionated? And so I spent most of my time fighting in record shops with adults about what was relevant. And around the time, at some point, I started migrating into bands. And when I was 13, I took two friends of mine, neither of which were into punk. One of which was a Led Zeppelin fan, and one of them was a guy who liked disco and rap, which was somewhat cutting edge at the time. And I said, we're now a punk band. And I made a cassette recording of the three of us sitting in a room, sort of improvising music that involved yelling. The song would break down. We'd start calling each other fag. And that started my career as a professional musician, because once I had pressed them, I knew I had to make money to pay for the pressing. So I became a professional musician by releasing a record of three 13-year-olds calling each other fag, which would probably not sell as well now.
Probably not, although, it's funny because you can take something like that and couch it in so many different ways. Within a certain context, it represents sort of like a performance art piece showing the essential evil of 13-year-olds, maybe. It could be many different things.
The thing that it left me with, the thing that turned me on about it, because it was a stupid thing that any 13-year-old might have done, except that I was born with severe learning disabilities, so I've always functioned in the world in a very broken manner. So having a musical situation where I'm playing with people who can't play. Now, I could play a little bit, and one of the other guys could play better than me. At this point, he can't, but I essentially formed a band with people who can't play music. And to me, having this background of non-music and trying to play sort of is what got me into jazz, what got me into listening to all kinds of different music, because it's an adventure. How does somebody who plays bass decently play with somebody who's a child?
Right.
You can't, and that's what actually got me ultimately a decade later, around, I think, version 2 or 2.5 with Max, was I met a gentleman who became my assistant in my recording studio, and he told me about Max. He was studying at Columbia, and he said, yeah, if you want to write software that will allow your MIDI instruments to play 3 notes over and over again that they randomly choose. And I said, oh my God, this is perfect for me.
Right.
Because it set up a surprise, which I then had to leap into and try to make the best of, which is kind of how life is for me. Since if you're learning disabled, you are constantly at odds with the world. And I don't know whether that is a coherent tangent or not, but the Brain People is the name of that band, and that's sort of how that is sort of the egg in which everything I do sort of comes from, because everything is about dealing with chaotic circumstances and trying to address them. All my Max work is about creating devices out of random number generators or pseudo-random number generators and having effect processors or synths that surprise me. Basically because the two guys really don't want to be in this band is now over 30 years later. And which is why I'm building the robot. He even has blue eyes to match the drummer who can't play either. So,
so the perfect replacement.
The only thing I can't get this robot to do and you might be able to help me because I know you're pretty swift with the Arduino, is that the drummer has a bit of a substance abuse issue and tends to do a lot of vomiting. And I haven't been able to figure out a way of setting up pneumatic pumps that maybe in time can vomit with the music.
Well, that would be a winner. I have to tell you, it's funny that you talk about this robotic drum thing because I actually have a robotic drum story. Back in, I'm guessing 1990, 1991, something like that. I had just moved to the big city, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Woohoo! And
Are you friends with Grant?
Yes, very. I have a long history with Grant, actually.
I love Grant.
Yeah, I used to. But anyway, we'll talk about that someday.
Are you going to interview him?
What's that?
Are you going to interview him?
I'm not sure that we're on speaking terms in a good enough way where that could happen.
Okay.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I mean, I'm sure that we each wish that we could replace the other with robots in our lives. But there you go. But yeah, so I moved to Milwaukee and I was trying to set up my little MIDI studio. I was just out of a divorce. I was trying to make my perfect life and I badly needed a drum machine. One day in the newspaper, a drum machine comes up for sale. The one I was interested in at the time, a Roland R8, going for really cheap. So I call up the guy. I'm like, oh man, Roland R8, really cool. Is it still for sale? He's like, yeah, come and get this piece of crap. So I'm like, okay, I'll do it. Just don't sell it before I get there. I drive over and I knock on the door and I'm like, I'm here for the drum machine. He's like, oh, the piece of crap. I'm like, yeah, okay, I think it's actually a pretty cool machine, but I'm happy to buy it off of you. So does it work and everything? He's like, as far as I can tell, it works, but for my purposes, it's a piece of crap. And I'm sensing a theme here, right? I'm like, so what were you trying to do that wasn't working? He's like, well, I was making a robotic drummer. I'm like, really? It sounds awesome. And he's like, yeah, and this Roland Mox is supposed to have humanizing characteristics that I wanted to use. And I was like, interesting. That's really cool. It's like, let's go out in the garage. I'll get you the machine. So we walk out to his garage, and to get to the place where the drum machine actually was, I had to wade through this enormous pile of punctured drum heads. These are piles taller than my head. Just hundreds and hundreds of drum heads with holes poked in them because he never could quite calibrate the pneumatics to do exactly what he wanted. And so I think in the end, he decided it was all that crap Roland drum machine that was causing the great big problem. But I don't know of that many people that have robot drum machine stories, so I thought that it would be worth sharing anyway.
It makes me want to sort of see if there are any outputs on the. I have a R8M here still. Yeah. I wonder if I could, I don't know, do something with that to get this guy to be a little bit more ambitious. Because the vomiting thing is like, I at this point I'm not even looking at that code. It's just It's not. The trick actually with now, unlike you and most people who do stuff like this, I really don't know what I'm doing, and in fact, my aforementioned learning disabilities, which are brain damage, mean that I can't do math. So everything I do is literally like I'm sitting there with the proverbial apple, tossing it up in the air and waiting for it to hit me in the head so I can figure out how stuff goes. So there's a lot of explosions, there's a lot of magic blue smoke, there's a lot of real, like, I've already blown out an Arduino board. But what I did learn, which could be helpful to somebody building, some idiot who wants to build a robot drummer, is whether you're using solenoids or servo motors, is make sure that you're doing, the striking is at a little bit of an angle, because you're more likely to get a little bit of a bounce back and a little bit more freedom. And so it'll sort of scrape the drum head and will make the drum noise without actually poking a hole in it.
Well, there you go. I mean, that probably could have saved Mr. Milwaukee drum robot guy an awful lot of headaches, because it was clear that he had pneumatics that were just like pounding their way right through the drum head. I mean, I just think back to that, and I was like, I wonder how many thousands of dollars of drum heads that was sitting in the garage. It was hilarious.
Well, but it was the 90s, and I think we all had a little bit more money at that time.
A little bit more money, and I think to continue punching holes through the same drum heads probably requires a pretty stiff intake of drugs and alcohol too, right? I have a feeling that there was some of that involved.
I don't think personally that I could be drinking and doing any of this stuff. I mean, I know that I banned alcohol from any kind of soldering situation because there have been too many bad incidences that I decided that I already have enough things going against me without actually adding alcohol to the mix. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't drink alcohol. I'm just saying you should do it after you solder or a few hours before.
Right.
But not during.
Well, I think one of the things that's really scary with soldering is that once you've been doing it for a while, you forget that you have a 700-degree poker in your hand.
Not me. I burn myself.
Well, yeah, I know. I do too. But it's always sort of like, oh, my eye itches, and I reach up, and all of a sudden I've burnt the bridge of my nose.
Right.
Know? Not a good plan. Yeah, no. So I can imagine that drinking with that is going to actually work out to the best. So I want to explore a little bit about this idea of your learning disability and how that might have actually informed you doing the things the way you do them. How does this disability express itself?
It's a number of different things, but they're essentially like dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia.
Okay.
So the one thing I have going for me is or two things: long-term memory and language skill. Everything else about me is virtually subhuman. My math skills may be third grade level. I have spatial perceptive issues, and I have problems with many different functions where messages have to bounce back and forth between the two hemispheres. And it's possible that there's damage to the corpus callosum.
Sure.
So what happens, for example, is if I've never learned to read music. I can't. I can hear it in my head, and I can play it. I can hear something once and play it, but I cannot actually read. I can't translate it into any kind of graphic. If I were to sit down and read something and then turn and try to write something about what I just read, I could not do it. So there's a problem with going from one discipline to the other in very, very specific ways. I mean, the rest of it is mostly your day-to-day existence. I go into a grocery store, I recognize things by the package because my instinct is not to look at the words. The important thing is that Mr. Bubble hasn't changed the package that much. I mean, they ruined him,
right,
from a cartoon standpoint, but they haven't changed the package, so I can actually buy Mr. Bubble.
Well, that's good. That kind of puts a framework around it, because that is really extensive, especially when you're working with music. You know, there are so many different ways that there are visual components to music. So there's sort of the standard notation, but there's also, you know, when you're working on a timeline in music software, there's the functional blocks and the time frames. There's all of the left to right orientation with markers and tracks and all that stuff. How mind-boggling is that to you?
Well, I'm actually considered an extremely good digital editor. I do, in fact, a lot of what was the movie? Was it Pulp Fiction, where Harvey Keitel plays the guy who's like the cleanup guy?
Yes, that's the one.
I get a lot of gigs where an older punk band from the 70s or early 80s, I get hired by a label who's doing, let's say, an archival thing. And there's a portion of the tape that may be damaged, and so a song needs to actually be rearranged in a way that doesn't sound like it was rearranged.
Sure.
And they hire me and they pay me, and I don't take a credit because nobody wants to think that the record they're listening to has been doctored in that manner, particularly with that music.
Right.
So with digital editing, for some reason, that works for me. And but I don't pay a lot of attention to the actual grid, the timeline. I don't work in that way. So I think I pay attention to what I know to pay attention to, and kind of block out the other stuff.
Yeah. So what is the stuff that you key off of? Is it the shape of the waveform?
Shape of the waveform, and I use my ears. I mean, I've been mixing records since I was 13, so I know what I'm listening for. I also know, particularly if we're not dealing with disco, you know, to hear a loose rock and roll type of track, you have to feel it. You can't really make it just on the money. It has to sort of sound good. And I spend all my free time listening to records, so I know what it's supposed to sound like. So it's just a question of nudging things until they sound right. So it's not actually that difficult as long as I ignore all the numbers.
Well, but that seems to be something that runs completely afoul to how people want to work these days. At one point, I had written some plugins, right? And I very specifically did not put specific timing indicators or specific frequencies, cutoffs for the filters or whatever, because I wanted to very much preference the use of your ears over the use of your eyes and your intellectual background, right?
Right.
People hated it. I had a lot of people who were like very adamant that I was messing up their ability to get their sound, and I was like, "What the heck are you talking about?"
I can solve this. Well, I can solve it. But this is going to be the big thing that people are going to learn from this particular podcast. People are fucking stupid. That's where the problem is.
Well, thank you so much. I needed to hear that.
Well, that's what's going to sell this whole thing, because the rest of the story is about a mental cripple and who makes robots that don't work. But yeah, that's really the problem. And people want everything handed to them. And you know what? Most people don't really know what those numbers are anyway.
They don't, or the other thing is it somehow makes, I mean, to me, sometimes things like the exact frequency of a filter cutoff, first of all, that's completely arbitrary. I mean, in a mathematical way, that means something, but in an audible way, it's kind of, there's a lot of wiggle room there. But secondly, I get this feeling like they want to see it. It is sort of like the numeric version of the walnut side panels that people put on
Right.
plugins, right?
Right.
It like makes them somehow feel like it's real gear, and that makes me sad sometimes.
Well, this may also be a newsflash. It kind of isn't. Anything that you anything that you can't actually physically lift and move from one place to another. I mean, are computers real? Yeah, but anything that's, if you can't go and recreate a musical situation 20 years later, it's hard for me to feel the same kind of relationship I have with hardware. And I know that that's counter where we are in the world, but I'm somebody who listens to LPs. And, well, I listen to most of 45, but,
Right.
I feel like, and I'm somebody who does actually keep going a lot of older computers because there are plugins, there are things that I want to continue using, and technology marches on in this very cruel way, leaving behind some great plugins. And it's a tough position to be in when whether you've spent money on it, whether you built it yourself, to have to go, oh yeah, I can't do that anymore.
Yeah, or especially if in some way you've like staked your artistic voice on something that's no longer technologically viable.
All those artists who decided that they were going to be using Cantos, that was one of those plugins. Okay, nobody used it except for me.
I know, but that was
it was cool looking though.
It was cool looking, and it was the thing with Cantos is you had to very particularly not be focused on getting what you thought you were going to get. And in a way, it sounds like it was probably the perfect plugin for you, because you talk about how you like being surprised by the system and then having to jump in with it, right?
Well, except that with Cantos, it had such a specific sound.
Oh, right.
And, I'm familiar enough with, let's say, hardware, where I'll do a song and I'll say, the guitar needs to be that 62 Jazzmaster going through the 4-knob Fender blender.
Right.
I mean, I hear it in my head and I go, that's what it needs to be. So the surprises need to be, like, I've played with people who play really fucking well. And I'm okay. At times I've been terrible. At times I'm okay. I'm an okay player. Mm-hmm. As a guitarist and as a bassist, I'm okay. But when you play with somebody who's really excellent, you're flying by the seat of your pants. It's just an amazing, wonderful thing. And the same for me as playing when I try to play music with children or with my two oldest friends. God forbid they'll listen to this podcast. But it's anything that is not me, is me trying to relate to the world. So I'm sort of fighting to either be better or worse, I guess. But it's the same challenge, one way or the other.
Sure.
So yeah, Cantos didn't work for me for that reason. But the one piece of software that killed me that it didn't move forward was SonicWorks Artist. That I love.
Yeah. That was one of those plug-in packages, and it was like such a broad base of little bits and pieces. Mm-hmm. But I remember like sitting with my Mac 66 or 660 AV, like going through each one and tweaking little things to hear. They had like oddball stuff like the anti-reverbs and stuff like that, right, that were just so creatively fun. And yeah, that never made the leap to OS 10, did it? No.
In fact, I keep an OS 9 machine just for that.
Oh, wow.
I have that with Pluggo in it. And maybe Hypno maybe in that as well.
There you go.
But I mean, that's it. That's the only reason that I have that OS 9 machine, really. is for that.
Sure. Sure. Now, if we talk about the concept of, sort of making work that's going to last over the long term, this also seems to kind of butt into a lot of work that you're interested in or you're kind of working with. So first of all, my assumption is that a lot of this recording work that you're doing with punk bands, especially like archival information, is all working on tape. So my assumption is you still have your hand in tape a bit, right?
Well, I do. Usually what happens is someone delivers depending on when it was transferred, usually it's been baked and transferred at some point. Very often somebody in the band at some point did something else where they had money.
Oh, okay.
And they had a big label or something behind them, and they snuck in and got the tape baked, and they transferred it to DAT.
Oh, nice.
And so they bring me a DAT tape, or they bring me a CDR.
Okay.
So I generally try to save the tape for when it's necessary.
Uh-huh.
And it's very often not necessary. And I also like to keep the budget under control.
Right, I hear that.
So I'll get the material, usually in a digital form. And then I sit down, usually I'll do it in Pro Tools. I'll do it as a 2-track. I might spread it out a little bit just to get those little mistakes lined up properly. Mm-hmm. But I do it like anybody else, with the exception that I don't look at the numbers.
Right.
I think I was actually thinking about I think the best example for where the numbers come into play in a really negative way, or where I can't get around it, is like when you're dealing with robotics and you have a servo motor and you are told that it has this amount of torque.
Mm-hmm.
For me to understand how much force it's going to use, at what speed it's going, plus the electrical of how much power it needs, it becomes a jumbled mess in my head.
I see. Right.
And usually involves me continually buying better and better servos until I have one that actually hits the drum or whatever it's supposed to do in a way that I'm satisfied.
Sure. Okay.
So it's those kind of things where you're dealing with science at a level that's well beyond my education or experience.
Right, but to a certain extent, whether it's the maker community or the creative coding community or whatever, they've kind of put together things so you can at least experiment with them. So it wasn't that long ago where if you wanted to do a microprocessor controlled anything, you better have your EE degree polished up, mm-hmm. because you're going to need every bit of it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I'm sort of in a lucky position because I was the dumb guy with the loud mouth at Max 2.0, who David happened to have a soft spot for, and so I never got thrown off the forum. And also, I'm not ashamed of saying I have no idea how to do this, or ask the same question over and over until I get, I don't have a problem saying I'm not like you guys. I'm not educated, nor do I have this skill base. But this is what I'm trying to do, and all I can do is hope that the idea I have is interesting or funny enough that somebody will say, you know what, I'm going to help this kid because
it'll capture their attention, right?
Yeah. And I had so many people reach out to me in that Max community and give me little bits of code and all of that. And I mean, some of them I'll talk to years later. They don't remember helping me.
Right.
I remember Jen. Is it Jem or Jen? It'll be embarrassing if he ever listens to the podcast. But I didn't even know at the time he was a member of the Pogues.
Okay.
Really nice guy. um, did really went way out of his way. David also went way out of his way for me. There's a lot of really great people in that community. I think that the modern modular synth world is very similar to that. I think you have a lot of people who actually like helping each other.
Yeah, so let's talk about that a little bit. What engagement do you have with modulars? I know we kind of got reconnected because you were selling, or you were thinking about selling some LZX gear. So,
well, you forget that I was involved with the Manta. So,
that's right, of course,
and I know that you had done that nice interface. Wasn't that or did you just do
that was
standalone?
I did a thing where it basically allowed you to use it as a strumming surface. I think you're thinking of the honeycomb thing.
Right. So that wasn't yours.
No, that was
you did the strumming surface. Did you also do the Max object?
No, Luc Dubois was working mostly with that.
So
I helped with some testing on it.
Had your feet up and didn't do anything here?
Thanks a lot for that. I really needed to hear that today.
Well, considering how Jeff talked, I had the sense that you were quite involved. So he may think that you were doing all kinds of stuff, or he certainly was quite happy with whatever else.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was that when I first saw it, it really rang some bells for me because it was the first thing I saw. I have real problems with my hands. My hands now are getting to a point that I have to be very careful about anything where I'm doing impact hits. Right. But it had already started to be a problem then. And when he first showed me this surface, I was like intrigued because it was the first time I could interact with a controller that wasn't either a grab and move kind of thing, nor was it an impact thing. I could just brush my hand across it, right? Yeah. And so I started talking to him a lot about what that meant to me. I had mocked up this strumming surface, and then he had brought the Manta out to the first Cycling 74 Expo. And I had, it was really early stages, but I had my little thing where I made like it was basically an auto harp, you know, for the Manta. And I helped him set that up, and I showed it to a bunch of people, and people's eyes lit up. And I think about half of the Mantas he ever sold were in one way or another related to that show and tell that he did where we were doing it. So.
He also, it speaks his language because he has a deep connection with traditional instruments and interfacing electronics and making electronic instruments that borrow from traditional instruments. So I think that the idea of strumming it really connected with him.
Yeah, probably so. Well, and it's funny because you look at the other instruments he's made, and all of it looks like, some sort of crazy steampunk combination of the 1800s and the 22nd century, right? So it's craziness.
He's one of the people that I think is one of the most interesting designers out there. Now, he and I have some definite disagreements. Like the whole MantaMate thing came about because I really felt like USB is a disposable thing, and it's connected to my computer, and I don't want it.
Right.
I want this thing to be standalone, and I kept bugging him about it. Like, can't you make, and I was saying like, make a Manta survival box. Because I love the Manta, but I don't want to attach. I don't want to make music always in front of the computer. And so I was just bugging him to find even the most bare bones way of doing this, so that the Manta could live on beyond, just like the plugin. So it could live on beyond its current state, and that sort of turned into the MantaMate.
Right. Well, now, getting back to the modular thing,
Okay.
again, that really kind of points to this idea of having music making devices that are not necessarily built for immediate disposability. Now, in preparation for this, you pointed me actually to the Optic Kinetics Solar 250 effects projector,
Right.
which was it was fun to see that. And actually, I think that I've
I got a
seen.
pile of them here.
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that it's something that I run into occasionally when I go to like old planetaria. They have them like, in the rim around the planetarium. They'll have
Nope,
lots of little
those
weird.
are star projectors.
Well, yeah, but at least some of the optical ones that I've seen also had effects projectors too, just for when they're doing like wacky Dark Side of the Moon night or whatever, But it looking at this and then kind of tying that in with an interest in the modular stuff, it really gave me this sense of sort of a person who gets some joyfulness out of kooky old hardware or kooky hardware, not whether it's old or new.
Yeah, I mean, I originally had and still have vintage synths, and I've always been a stomp box guy, and I've always liked gizmos, and I collect instruments that are bizarre, whether they're acoustic or electric or whatever. So I have, and I sort of want, I want everything, every possibility at my fingertips, which is not necessarily realistic, but is, my nature. And I got into vintage lighting, and the vintage lighting thing also was a position where I did not know anything about it, and I had an optokinetic projector that my aunt had like a sort of little disco in her basement. And she was closing her house up, and she said, "Do you want this thing?" And I said, "Oh yeah, of course." And it ended up in storage. And after my marriage ended, it was one of the things that I kind of pulled out. And in my grief, instead of going for making an album about how fucked up and sad I was, I went toward the light. But instead of using the wheels that these things come, that were made for them, I started making my own. So I would use the prisms and all the electronics and stuff that come with them, and I started collecting all the ephemera and all that stuff. But I was also building my own as well. And so there is a tie between that stuff and the modular synths, because the light show thing, I mean, these come from the psychedelic light shows.
Right.
People started going, you know what? The whole oil thing is a fucking mess. We're not going to do it. And mobile DJs started using things like this, and small clubs started using things like this because they weren't messy.
Right.
Same thing as the modular synths became mini moogs and other things like that.
Right. Much less messy on stage, right?
It's less messy and roadworthy. And I like roadworthy, even though I'm somebody who prefers the studio. I like things to be made well. And now that we're in this place where companies like Doper sort of kicked off this modular revolution, which it really, in many ways, is way beyond. It is more of a true revolution than the original thing was.
Oh, I agree.
We now have stuff that doesn't fall apart. I mean, yeah, it's charming that my EML 101 kind of sounds a little broken, but it's still, I can't open it up and replace a part. Actually, the EML particularly, because the wiring is so horrible.
Right.
But, you can't, it's not quite the same thing. And now you have all of these companies making the modern modular synths, and they've opened up all sorts of doors they've opened up negative doors too. Personally, it makes me insane that people don't understand that a synthesizer contains specific components, that just simply having an electronic noise is not a synthesizer.
Right.
And is not synthesizing. If you heard that bang, yeah. I don't know if did you hear that bang?
I did, yes.
There's a woman who lives above me who wears Uggs, and I sometimes write about her on the interwebs because I really don't like to fight with my neighbors because I think you live with them, so you should try to be pleasant.
Right.
But whenever she does things like that, I think it was her falling over or something, I comment. So the woman with the Uggs just
keeled over.
Yeah. But I do, as picky as I am about the modular synth thing, I do like the fact that it makes people who are never going to learn how to play a traditional instrument make music. Like now you have problems with your hands now, and with the Manta you can strum. All of a sudden you can do a gesture that wasn't that comfortable.
Right.
So I like anything that puts art right in your hands, as long as it doesn't make you do it in a very specific way.
Sure. Yeah. That
like
makes sense.
GarageBand is crap. Things like that where there's no creativity.
Yeah.
But when non-musicians can do it, it's great. I mean, obviously there's going to be a reckoning since there's so many bad records coming out. At some point, all these kids are buying modular stuff right now. 90% of them are going to dump them.
Right.
As they get interested in something else, maybe trading baseball cards or whatever. But technology needs to have those explosions and then, peters out and then comes back.
Right.
And that's what's happened with the lighting thing, too, I think. It certainly has happened, I know, with laser technology. And I think robotics is also one of those things that sort of was a hobby thing, but nobody could really do it properly. And now it's computing. I mean, computing is I think it's constantly a up and down thing as we experiment with something, go only as far as we can go, and we have to wait for technology to catch up to us.
Yeah, it's really interesting you say that. Last week I interviewed Tim Weaver, who's an academic that works in media arts, and we were kind of talking about this ebb and flow as well. Now, I hadn't really thought of it quite in the terms that you just laid it out, but, a really good example of that is the whole virtual reality thing, which was, was really groovy there for a while, and then everyone got bored of it, and then the next thing Oculus Rift makes some technological advancements, and all of a sudden it's back in play again, which is, I guess, interesting. I don't know, maybe that's... You were talking about trying to find a way to make your robotic drummer puke, but maybe if you gave everyone VR goggles, your audience could all puke, and you wouldn't have to worry about the...
I've never had a problem getting the audience to puke. That's not the issue. The issue is that the real drummer vomits a lot, and this robot doesn't.
So you're just looking for more quantity.
Yeah. And I'm thinking American Science and Surplus is having a sale on pneumatics, so I'm going to probably try to rig something up.
Gonna dive into it, huh?
Yeah.
Well, Tommy, it was funny because when we first started talking about this, you're like, I don't know where we're going to come up with 45 minutes. And so now we're an hour in. And I want to kind of wrap it up. I don't want to use up any more of your time, but I would like to know, because you've been doing this for a long time and because you have very peculiar interests, and particularly interests that...
Wait, are we talking about my sex life?
No. We're talking about instruments, man. I don't want to... That's a different podcast. Which I'll be calling you back at 2 a.m. for that one. No. But Yeah.
I'll be wearing a fur coat.
Yeah.
And flippers.
And I'll be wearing a glove. But anyway, I would like to know from you, what is the most bizarre instrument that you have, or bizarre instruments of whatever type, whether it's visual or musical or whatever, and what's the thing that's the white whale? What's the thing that you're looking for?
Man, instruments are so, in itself, they're so bizarre to begin with. I mean, whether I were to say any number of things that Reed Gonzalez built for me, or water phones, or, I mean, I have so many, I made a series of horns out of toilet plumbing. I collect animal hunting calls. I don't know if there is a single bizarre thing. It's probably me. I mean, I'm the instrument, I guess.
Sure,
It's
good
bizarre.
point.
The white whale might also be me. It could also be a matrix mixer for my Moog. I haven't. I've been very lucky, and I have not. I've always had dreams that were just a little bit out of my reach.
Right.
And so I've been able to do things, including building a Moog, one module at a time. So I don't know that there's a white whale. There's always a white whale, but there isn't one at this moment. I'd like an electric banjo, one of the Teisco ones.
Oh, sure.
There's always something. I mean, I'm a collector, so every day of my life there are packages arriving with 45s in them. There's constantly parts and records coming into my house. My wife left me because of this, or part of it anyway. The other part was the flippers and the fur coat.
Well, there's that.
Yeah, it's hard to say. But there's always a white whale. It's just, what's this week's white whale?
Sure, I hear that. Well, it has been fascinating, and you've left enough over the course of this conversation. You've now left enough breadcrumbs that we're going to have to come back and talk about some of these things. But it was fascinating to get a little more in depth with you than certainly I have. This is easily the longest conversation we've had. And but it was really great to have the chat and to kind of share some of this with the world, and to kind of really see how you've integrated sort of the punk philosophy of life with technological one, and all wrapped up in sort of the difficulties in life that got dealt out. So it was really interesting, and I thank you so much for taking the time.
I thank you. To be in your company and to be in the company of some of the people you've interviewed, it's a big compliment.
Well, thanks a lot. All right, you have a great evening, and we'll talk again soon.
All right, man.
All right, bye.
Bye.
Wow, that was pretty incredible. As you can imagine, there's a lot of additional things I would like to dive into there. I really would like to know a little bit more about him growing up and growing through the punk world, but also at the same time embracing sort of the technology end of things. Sounds pretty incredible, and sounds like a pretty fun life to me. So I want to take this opportunity again, thank everybody that is listening and passing these along to friends. Here's my call to action for this week. If you could do me a favor and just reach out to one person and say, hey, check out these podcasts. Let's see if we can get a little jump in our listenership. We're getting close to number 50, which is kind of a really cool bridge point for me. That'll represent roughly 1 year's worth of podcasts. But also I'm going to try and pull together a special guest for that one. So hopefully that works out. But in the meantime, keep on racking up your listens. If you have any questions or any ideas, please reach out. I've been getting good suggestions, and I'm trying to follow up on them. And in the meantime, thanks again for listening. Drop me a line if you have anything to say. Otherwise, I'll talk to you next week. Bye.